January 1949. A young woman in a white wedding gown stands outside a church in Rome, surrounded by thousands of people who climbed walls and pushed past police barriers just to see her. The man beside her is Tyrone Power, one of the biggest film stars on earth. The photographs ran on front pages across the world. The woman was Linda Christian, and if that name doesn't land the way it once did, that's exactly why her story is worth telling. She crossed oceans on almost nothing, talked her way into Hollywood, and moved through the highest circles of European nobility, only for it all to unravel in ways that were stranger and sadder than most people ever knew. And it starts not in Rome, not in Hollywood, but somewhere most people would never expect. Segment 7. Tampico, Mexico, and a childhood that belonged to no country. Linda Christian was born Blanca Rosa Welter on November 13, 1923, in Tampico, Mexico. Her father, Friedrich Welter, was a Dutch oil executive, and her mother, Frieda Krakow, was German. That combination alone placed her outside any simple category. She was not Mexican by heritage, not American, not European in the conventional sense. She was, from the very beginning, someone who did not quite fit into any one place, and who would spend most of her life moving between them. Tampico in the 1920s was a boomtown, full of foreign workers brought in by the oil industry, and the Welter family was part of that world. But the stability that came with it did not last. Friedrich Welter's work took the family to different parts of the world as Linda was growing up, to South Africa, to Palestine, to Switzerland. By the time she was a teenager, she had lived in more countries than most people visit in a lifetime. She spoke multiple languages, including Spanish, English, German, French, and Italian. That skill would prove useful in ways she could not yet imagine. She was living in Mexico City when the Second World War broke out, and it was there, as a teenager, that she began to think seriously about acting. She had always been striking in appearance, tall, dark-haired, with features that photographers responded to immediately. But it was more than that. She had a kind of presence that people noticed even in ordinary situations, a quality that could not be taught or manufactured. In the early 1940s, she made her way to Los Angeles. She did not arrive with money or connections or a manager. What she arrived with was confidence, a handful of languages, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary to get herself in front of the right people. She found work as an extra, and she took Spanish language roles where she could. But the bigger goal was always the same: to work at one of the major studios and to be taken seriously as a leading actress. She managed to get herself in front of Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM, and reportedly made enough of an impression that he signed her to the studio. She was given a screen name, Linda Christian, which had a ring to it that her birth name did not. And though her time at MGM would not produce the landmark roles she had hoped for, simply being under contract at the largest studio in Hollywood in the mid-1940s was no small thing for a young woman who had arrived in the country essentially on her own terms. She appeared in a small number of films during this period, including a role in the 1945 film Holiday in Mexico, and later in Tarzan and the Mermaids in 1948. These were not career-defining performances, but they kept her visible, and visibility was the currency that mattered most. She was beginning to attract attention not only as a working actress, but as a figure in her own right, someone whose name appeared in the gossip columns, whose photographs sold magazines, whose presence at a party was worth noting. But the turning point, the moment that would define the next decade of her life, was not a film role. It was a man she met at a party in Hollywood sometime around 1946. His name was Tyrone Power. What happened between Linda Christian and Tyrone Power would play out in front of the entire world and end in a way that neither of them could have predicted when they first met. Segment 6. Tyrone Power and the Wedding That Stopped Rome. Tyrone Power was, in the mid-1940s, among the most recognized faces in the world. He had appeared in films like The Mark of Zorro, Blood and Sand, and A Yank in the Oxford. And his looks, dark-haired, classically handsome, with a warmth on screen that translated into genuine mass appeal, had made him a star of the First Order. He had served in the United States Marine Corps during the Second World War, flying transport missions in the Pacific, and had returned to Hollywood with both his career intact and a kind of gravity that the war years had given many men of his generation. When he met Linda Christian, he was recently divorced from the French actress Annabella, and Linda was at a point in her own life where she was beginning to feel that her career in Hollywood, while real, was not growing the way she had hoped. What began between them was, by all accounts, a genuine and intense romance. Power was drawn to her intelligence and her ease in the world. She moved through social situations with a confidence that made her seem entirely at home in rooms full of powerful people. He pursued her seriously, and within a year or so of their meeting, they were engaged. The wedding took place on January 27th, 1949, at the Church of Santa Francesca Romana in Rome. It was not a quiet affair. Italian authorities later described the scene outside the church as one of the largest crowds they had managed in years. Thousands of people had gathered in the streets around the forum, climbing onto ruins and railings, pushing against police barriers. Inside, the ceremony was attended by a guest list that read like a roll call of post-war European society. Diplomats, filmmakers, Italian nobility, and American expatriates who had settled in Rome after the war. Linda wore a gown designed by the Fontana sisters, one of the most prominent names in Roman couture at the time, and the images from that day ran on the front pages of newspapers across Europe and the United States. It was, in a very real sense, the apex of her public visibility. At 25 years old, she was one of the most talked-about women in the world. The couple settled for stretches of time in Europe, particularly in Rome, and it was during these years that Linda began to fully enter the world of European aristocracy. She had always been comfortable in cosmopolitan settings, and Italy in the late 1940s and early 1950s was a place where old nobility, new money, and the international film world all mixed in a way that was unique to the post-war moment. She made friends easily among titled families, attended events that few outsiders would ever be invited to, and was spoken about in Italian society columns with a regularity that suggested she had become a genuine presence in that world, not merely a visiting film star. She and Tyrone Power had two daughters together, Romina Power, born in 1951, and Taryn Power, born in 1953. Both would go on to have their own careers in entertainment, Romina as a singer and actress, Taryn as an actress. But even as the family was growing, the marriage was beginning to show signs of strain. Power was not, by all contemporary accounts, a man who found monogamy easy. His previous marriage had ended partly for similar reasons, and during the years of his marriage to Linda, there were reports, some of which became public knowledge at the time, of involvement with other women. Linda, for her part, was not someone who responded to difficulty by becoming smaller or quieter. By the mid-1950s, the tensions between them had become, in the language of the period, an open secret in Hollywood and Roman social circles alike. The couple separated, and their divorce was finalized in 1956. Linda retained custody of their daughters. Tyrone Power moved on and later married Deborah Ann Minados in 1958. He died later that same year, on November 15th, 1958, while filming Solomon and Sheba in Madrid. He suffered a heart attack during the filming of a dueling scene and died before he could be taken to a hospital. He was 44 years old. Linda was 34 when Power died. They had been divorced for 2 years, and she had already moved forward into a different chapter of her life. But the news of his death, sudden at such a young age, in the middle of a working day, could not have been uncomplicated for her to receive. He had been the great public event of her life, and whatever had gone wrong between them, he remained the father of her children. But Linda Christian did not disappear into grief. In fact, the years that followed Tyrone Power's death would pull her deeper into a world of wealth and European nobility than even her marriage had, with consequences that were far more dangerous than a difficult divorce. Segment 5. Porfirio Rubirosa and the most talked about man in the world. To understand what came next in Linda Christian's life, you first have to understand who Porfirio Rubirosa was. Because in the late 1950s, there were very few people in the world who did not have an opinion about him. Rubirosa was Dominican. He had been born in 1909 in San Francisco de Macorís and had risen through the military ranks under the regime of Rafael Trujillo, the Dominican dictator who ruled the country from 1930 until his assassination in 1961. Rubirosa had married one of Trujillo's daughters early in his career, which had given him diplomatic status and a degree of protection that other men in his position might not have had. He used both freely. By the time Linda Christian encountered him in the late 1950s, Rubirosa had already been married 4 times, to Trujillo's daughter Flor de Oro, then to the French actress Danielle Darrieux, then to the American tobacco heiress Doris Duke, and then to the American socialite Barbara Hutton. The last 2 marriages had lasted very briefly. The marriage to Doris Duke lasted approximately a year, and the one to Barbara Hutton lasted a matter of weeks. But both women had reportedly given him extraordinarily generous financial gifts at the time of the divorce. Rubirosa's name had become, in the gossip columns of New York, Paris, and Rome, almost synonymous with a certain kind of reckless, magnetic charm that wealthy women seemed to find irresistible and dangerous in equal measure. He was also a competitive polo player, a racing driver, and a diplomat who used his title liberally while doing very little actual diplomatic work. He drove fast cars, kept a house in Paris, and an apartment in New York, wore his clothes well, and had a talent for making everyone in a room feel as though they had his full attention. He was also, by all accounts, someone who lived entirely in the present tense, with little apparent concern for consequences. Linda Christian and Rubirosa began a relationship sometime around 1958 or 1959. By 1959, they were being photographed together at parties and racing events across Europe, and their names were appearing together in the press regularly. For Linda, who was by this point a genuinely famous figure in her own right, not just as Tyrone Power's ex-wife, but as a woman who had built her own social world across 2 continents, the relationship with Rubirosa was, on the surface, consistent with the life she had been living. She moved in those circles. She knew those people. But Rubirosa was not like the other men she had known. He was not a film star with professional ambitions and a publicist managing his image. He was something both more glamorous and more precarious. A man whose entire existence seemed to run on social access, physical daring, and the goodwill of people far wealthier than himself. There was an instability beneath the surface of his life that was not visible from the outside, but which the people closest to him understood very well. The relationship between Linda and Rubirosa was, by all contemporary accounts, volatile. They were both strong-willed, both accustomed to being the most noticed person in a room, and both capable of a kind of intensity that made their time together exciting and, at times, genuinely unsettling to those around them. There were reported public disagreements, periods of separation, and reconciliations that the press followed with the same attention they gave to political events. One incident in particular attracted considerable attention. In 1959, Linda was involved in a serious automobile accident in Rome that left her hospitalized. The precise circumstances were not reported in full detail at the time, but accounts from people who were part of that social world later described the period as one during which the relationship between the two of them had reached a particularly difficult point. The accident, whatever its exact cause, was serious enough to require a significant recovery period and left marks on Linda's life that went beyond the physical. She and Rubirosa did not marry. They remained entangled and then separated without a clean ending. Rubirosa had already married a fifth time, to a young French actress named Odile Rodin in 1956, a marriage that was still ongoing when he died. He was killed in a car crash in Paris on July 5, 1965, early in the morning, after a night of celebrating a polo victory with his team at the Racing Club de France. He had driven his Ferrari into a chestnut tree in the Bois de Boulogne. He was 56 years old. By the time of Rubirosa's death, Linda had already moved on to yet another chapter, one that would take her deeper into European aristocracy than she had ever been, and closer to genuine tragedy than anything that had come before. Because the man who would come next was not a film star, and not an adventurer. He was connected to one of Rome's oldest noble families, and the story of what happened between them is one of the strangest and saddest chapters of Linda Christian's entire life. Segment 4. Edmund Purdom and the Years of Real Turmoil. Before we reach that chapter, there is another name that belongs in Linda Christian's story, one that tends to get overshadowed by the more famous figures on either side of it, but which represents one of the most turbulent periods of her personal life. Edmund Purdom was a British actor who had a brief but notable moment of Hollywood prominence in the mid-1950s. He had been brought in to replace Mario Lanza in the 1954 MGM musical The Student Prince, after Lanza's disputes with the studio made it impossible to complete filming with him. Purdom stepped in, the film was completed using Lanza's pre-recorded vocals, and The Student Prince was a commercial success. Purdom followed it with the 1954 epic The Egyptian, again for MGM, and briefly seemed to be on the verge of a sustained major career. It did not materialize. The roles dried up faster than they had appeared, and by the late 1950s, Purdom was working primarily in European productions, the Italian adventure films known as peplum movies that were enormously popular in Europe at the time, but carried little prestige in the United States. He was handsome, cultivated, and had a natural ease in front of a camera, but he had not been able to sustain the momentum that his early MGM years had briefly generated. He and Linda Christian began a relationship in the late 1950s, and for a period it was a serious one. They were seen together frequently in Rome and across the European circuit of parties and social events that both of them moved in. It was a relationship between two people who understood each other's worlds. Both had tasted Hollywood success without fully holding on to it. Both had chosen to build their lives primarily in Europe, and both were navigating what it meant to remain someone in a world that measured relevance in very particular ways. The relationship had genuine warmth to it, at least in its early stages, but it also had considerable difficulty. Purdom had a complicated personal history of his own. He had been married before, and had a reputation among people who knew him well for being unreliable in sustained relationships. The combination of two people with strong personalities, uncertain professional circumstances, and lives lived largely in public produced a volatile dynamic. One episode from this period that was reported in the Italian press at the time involved a confrontation between Linda and Purdom that turned physically harmful toward her. The details were not widely circulated outside the Italian entertainment press, and the story was not fully confirmed at the time, but it was mentioned in accounts of Linda's life written in later years by people who had known her during that period. Whatever happened between them, the relationship eventually ended, and Linda moved forward. What is worth noting about this period is not just the events themselves, but what they say about the broader circumstances of Linda's life in the late 1950s and early 1960s. She was a woman who had reached the absolute peak of public visibility in 1949 and had spent the years since navigating a world that had not quite figured out what to do with her. She was too famous to be invisible, but the film work had never delivered the sustained career she had once expected. She was known more for the men she was associated with than for the work she had done, not through any lack of ability, but through the particular way the entertainment industry and the society press of the time organized their attention. She continued to act, taking roles in Italian and European productions throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. Films like Slaves of Babylon in 1953 and The VIPs in 1963 kept her working. But these were not the kind of projects that generated serious critical attention or built lasting reputations. Her real life, the life that mattered to the newspapers and the public, was being lived off-screen in the restaurants and villas and racing circuits of Rome and the south of France and Madrid. And it was in that world, in the early 1960s, that she met the man whose name would become the last major chapter in her public romantic life. He was Italian, he was titled, and his connection to Linda Christian would end in a tragedy so public and so devastating that it changed the way Rome's aristocratic world talked about itself for years afterward. Segment 3. Prince Aldobrandini, Roman Nobility, and a Tragedy in the Alps. The man was Piero Aldobrandini, a member of one of the oldest and most distinguished families in Roman aristocratic history. The Aldobrandini family had roots in Florence and had been prominent in Rome since the 16th century. They were connected by blood and by marriage to the papal nobility, the network of ancient families whose titles and social standing had survived the transformation of Italy from a collection of city-states and papal territories into a unified republic. By the 1960s, the practical power of those titles had long since faded, but the social weight remained considerable. In the circles Linda Christian had been moving through since the early 1950s, the Aldobrandini name carried real meaning. Piero was considerably younger than Linda, by some accounts, close to a decade younger. That kind of age gap was not unusual in Roman society at the time, and it was not the subject of particular comment in the press when the relationship between the two of them became known. What was commented on, with the mixture of admiration and wariness that characterized how Roman high society talked about people it both admired and resented, was the intensity of it. They were together for a period that stretched through the mid-1960s, and during that time, Linda seemed, to many observers, to have finally found something stable. Rome was, in a sense, her true home by this point. She had been living there, on and off, for nearly 20 years. She had friendships in the city that went back decades. She knew the streets and the churches and the restaurants the way a person knows a place they have genuinely inhabited, not just visited. And she was part of the fabric of Roman society in a way that was, by then, entirely natural. But the relationship with Piero Aldobrandini carried with it a weight of old-world expectation that was different from anything Linda had navigated before. Roman aristocratic families of that period were not straightforwardly modern in their attitudes toward women, relationships, or the idea of a foreign-born actress, however famous, however well-connected, becoming a permanent part of their world. There were relatives, traditions, and obligations that existed independently of whatever two people might feel for each other. The story of what ended the relationship has been told in different ways in different accounts of Linda's life, and the full picture is not something that can be reconstructed from public sources with complete confidence. What is known is that by the late 1960s, the relationship had ended, and that the circumstances surrounding its end involved a level of loss that went beyond ordinary romantic difficulty. In 1968, Piero Aldobrandini died in a skiing accident in the Alps. He was young, in his mid-30s, and the death was sudden and unexpected in the way that accidents always are. Linda, by all accounts, was devastated. People who knew her at the time described her as genuinely grief-stricken in a way that was different from the public performances of sorrow that public figures sometimes have to put on for the press. This was private and deep and lasting. It was also, in a certain sense, the moment at which the long arc of Linda Christian's public romantic life came to its most painful point. She had been through a celebrated marriage, a difficult divorce, a dangerous entanglement with one of the most reckless men of his era, and a volatile relationship that had reportedly turned harmful at times. And now this, a quiet, sudden loss in the mountains, with no dramatic scene and no resolution, just an absence where a person had been. She was in her mid-40s. Her daughters were teenagers. She had a life that still contained people who cared about her, work she could do, and a city she genuinely loved. But the photographs from this period show a woman who carries something different in her expression than the ones from the 1940s and 1950s. Something that the camera picks up even when a person is not consciously showing it. Rome in the late 1960s was also a city undergoing enormous change. The glamour of the La Dolce Vita years, the period roughly from the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s, when Rome had been one of the most photographed and celebrated cities in the world, when the Via Veneto was lined with the most famous faces on earth, and the paparazzi culture that Fellini had documented so mercilessly was at its height. That moment was ending. The film industry had shifted. The money had moved. The people who had defined that world were aging or dying or simply drifting somewhere else. Linda remained. She stayed in Rome, continued to maintain her connections, and in the 1970s began writing her memoir, a project that would eventually be published in 1986 under the title Linda, My Own Story. The book was frank in some respects and carefully evasive in others, as memoirs written by people who are still alive and still have people to protect almost always are. But it confirmed the broad outlines of the life she had lived, and it gave readers a sense of the voice behind the famous face, a voice that was, according to reviews at the time, wry, warm, and occasionally very sad. But even in the quieter years that followed, Linda Christian's life would take one more unexpected turn, one that brought her full circle back to the United States, and into a kind of late-life peace that she had perhaps not expected to find. Segment 2. The long quiet, the daughters, and what remained. After the 1960s, Linda Christian's name appeared in the press with decreasing frequency. She did not disappear. She made choices. She continued to live primarily in Europe through the 1970s, spending time between Rome and other parts of Italy, and occasionally returning to the United States. She appeared in a small number of films and television productions during this period, though none of them generated significant attention. Her screen career had, for all practical purposes, wound down, not with a definitive final role, but with the gradual thinning out that happens to most actors who came of age in the studio system and found themselves in a world that no longer operated on those terms. What she invested in during these years, by all accounts, was her family. Her daughters, Romina and Taryn, were both building careers of their own, and their relationship with Linda was by the accounts of those who knew the family, genuinely close. Romina, in particular, had become a major star in Italy and across Europe, performing as part of the duo Albano and Romina Power, with her husband Albano Carisi. Their music was enormously popular across the continent through the 1970s and 1980s, and Romina's public profile in Italy rivaled or exceeded what her mother's had been at the peak of the earlier era. There was something quietly significant about that. Linda had arrived in Rome in the early 1950s as one of the most famous women in the city, and had watched her own daughter become one of the most beloved performers in the country, in the same city, in the same cultural world, but in a way that was entirely Romina's own. The two women had a bond that was visible to anyone who observed them together, and people who knew both of them have described Linda's pride in Romina's career as one of the most genuine and uncomplicated emotions of her later life. Taryn Power's path was more difficult. She had pursued an acting career with genuine commitment, appearing in several films in the 1970s, and had built her own life. But the shadow of her father's name, Tyrone Power, remained, decades after his death, one of the most recognized faces of Hollywood's golden era, was something she navigated consciously throughout her adult life. Linda was, by all accounts, aware of how her daughters had been affected by the circumstances of their upbringing, the divorce, the famous father who had died young, the European life that was culturally rich, but also in some ways rootless. And she carried that awareness with her. In the 1980s, Linda eventually moved back to the United States, settling before eventually making her home in Palm Springs, California, a place associated in the American imagination with a certain kind of sunlit retirement from the more frantic pace of public life. Palm Springs had been a destination for Hollywood figures since the 1930s, and there was a community there of people who had lived the kind of life Linda had lived, who did not need explanation or history, who simply understood the terrain of a certain kind of 20th century existence. She lived there quietly, maintained her friendships, and was periodically visited by journalists and documentary makers who were interested in her memories of the post-war years in Rome, the world of Tyrone Power, and the particular social universe that the Via Veneto had briefly represented. She was a generous and candid interviewee, and those who spoke with her in her later years consistently described her as someone who had made a kind of peace with her past. Not by revising it or romanticizing it beyond recognition, but by simply knowing it well enough that it no longer surprised her. She spoke about Tyrone Power with a kind of measured honesty, acknowledging the happiness, acknowledging the difficulty, not pretending that the divorce had been painless, but also not dramatizing it in the way that the press had always been eager for her to do. She spoke about Rome with genuine affection, describing it as the place where she had felt most fully herself. She spoke about her daughters with the particular kind of pride that comes not just from love, but from respect, from watching someone become themselves. She did not speak at length, at least not in public, about the more difficult episodes, the harm she had reportedly experienced, the grief over Piero Aldobrandini's death, the years of the late 1950s and early 1960s that had been the hardest. That kind of discretion was a quality she had always had, and it did not leave her in old age. The memoir she published in 1986 was the fullest account she gave of her own life, and even there, the prose moved quickly past certain moments that a less disciplined writer might have lingered over. The title, Linda, My Own Story, carried its own meaning. This was her version, on her terms, at a time of her choosing. That was not nothing, for a woman whose life had so often been narrated by other people, by the gossip columns, by the fan magazines, by the husbands and lovers whose names had always appeared alongside or in front of her own. But the final years were coming, and they would come with a particular kind of difficulty, the slow, private kind that receives far less attention than the dramatic kind and is often far harder to bear. Segment 1. The Final Years and the End. Linda Christian spent the last years of her life in Palm Springs. She was, by this point, in her 80s, and the world she had inhabited, the world of the Via Veneto and Cinecittà studios and European aristocratic parties, had receded so far into history that younger people encountered it, if at all, through old photographs and film retrospectives and the occasional documentary. The Rome of the 1950s had become, in the cultural imagination, almost mythological, a place of permanent golden light where beautiful people moved through wide piazzas in expensive clothes. The reality had been more complicated than that, and Linda knew it better than anyone. She had health difficulties in her final years, as most people do at that age, and she was increasingly reliant on the people around her daughters, close friends, the small community of Palm Springs that had known her for years. She remained mentally sharp, by all accounts, and retained the quality that people had always noted about her: a directness of observation, a lack of sentimentality about herself, a wry recognition of the distance between how things had looked from the outside and how they had actually been. Her daughter, Romina, in particular, was present through these years in ways that were genuinely sustaining. Romina had her own history of loss to carry. Her daughter, Elenia Carisi, had disappeared in New Orleans in 1994, under circumstances that were never fully resolved, and the grief of that had been a defining feature of Romina's adult life. The bond between mother and daughter during Linda's final years was shaped, in part, by the fact that both of them understood, in very personal terms, what it meant to lose someone without a complete explanation. Linda Christian died on July 22, 2011, in Palm Springs, California. She was 87 years old. The cause of death was reported as heart failure. She had been in declining health for some time before her death, and while it was not sudden in the way that Tyrone Power's death had been sudden, or Piero Aldobrandini's, it was still the end of a life that had spanned an extraordinary range of history and geography and human experience. The obituaries that ran in the days following her death were, in many cases, shaped primarily around Tyrone Power, around the famous wedding, the famous marriage, the famous divorce. That was, in a sense, the story the press had always told about her, and it did not change simply because she was no longer alive to push back against it. Some of the longer obituaries attempted to give a fuller picture, to account for the years in Rome, the relationships that had followed, the memoir, the late quiet decades in California. But the framing was always, in some measure, defined by the man she had married 62 years earlier in a church by the Forum. What those obituaries missed, or underplayed, was the texture of what she had actually done with her life. She had been born in a Mexican oil town to Dutch and German parents, had grown up across 4 continents, had taught herself multiple languages, had talked her way into the largest film studio in Hollywood with no connections and no money, had married one of the most famous men in the world, had moved through European aristocracy on her own terms, had survived a harmful relationship, had lost people she loved in sudden and irreversible ways, had raised 2 daughters who both built real and meaningful lives of their own, had written a book about it all, and had then lived for another 25 years in the California sunshine, growing old among people who cared about her. That is not a tragic life in the simple sense. It is a complicated life, one with genuine highs and genuine lows and a great deal of in-between, the same as almost every life. But it is the complications that make it worth understanding, and the simplifications. The wedding photo, the famous name, the headline about a film star's widow, that make it easy to miss. She was not ultimately defined by the men she knew. She was defined by the fact that she kept going, through the grief, through the difficulty, through the decades when the world had largely moved on to new faces and new stories. She kept going, and she kept herself intact, and she died at 87 in the sun, with her daughters near her. For a woman who had started with so little and reached so far, that is not nothing. That is, in the end, everything. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.